The smell of fear has a taste. It sits heavy on the tongue, like copper and salt. Samuel Ward had learned this truth 6 months ago when the Vorth raiders tore through his cargo ship. Now he stood in a metal cage with 40 other beings, breathing that same fear while buyers walked past and examined them like cattle. The auction house on Dravith 7 was a massive underground chamber carved into the rock of a dead moon. Thousands of slaves filled hundreds of cages. Some wept. Most stayed silent. They had learned that noise brought pain. Samuel watched the Vorth move between the rows. They were tall creatures, almost 8 feet, with pale white skin stretched over angular bodies. Their heads held 4 black eyes each, and their mouths clicked when they spoke. They walked like they owned everything because they did. For 300 years, the Vorth hegemony had ruled this sector of space. They had crushed every species that resisted. Now those species worked and died in Vorth mines, Vorth factories, and Vorth fields that a small reptilian creature pressed against Samuel's leg. It had 4 arms and scales the color of dried mud. Samuel had learned these were Pelori. Once they had been poets and thinkers. Now they were property. Do not look at them directly, the Pelori whispered. They punish direct eye contact. Samuel said nothing. He had already learned that lesson. The scar across his jaw was still fresh. A Vorth overseer stopped at their cage. His uniform marked him as someone important. Commandant Silas, the other slaves had called him during processing. He ran the auctions on this moon. He decided who lived, who died, and who wished they could die. Silas studied a data tablet and then looked at Samuel. Those 4 black eyes held nothing that Samuel could recognize as emotion. The human, Silas clicked. Gotta go hold it. Captured near the fringe. 6 escape attempts in 6 months. Killed 2 guards during the 3rd attempt. He made a sound that might have been laughter. Unbreakable merchandise. Recommended for the death pits. Samuel felt the eyes of every slave in the cage turn toward him. The death pits were where the Vorth sent prisoners they could not control. It was entertainment for them. Slaves fought each other until one remained. And then that one was killed anyway that a buyer approached. He was a smaller Vorth with 1 damaged eye, the manager of a mining operation on the dark side of the moon. He looked at Samuel the way someone might look at a broken tool. How much for the human? You do not want him, Silas said. Humans are deathworlders. They come from a planet with extreme gravity, extreme weather, and extreme predators. This one still thinks he can fight. The buyer clicked his mouth in amusement. My tunnels will teach him otherwise. I need bodies. The crystal deposits are expanding, and I'm losing workers to cave-ins every week. The price was negotiated. Samuel was sold for less than the Pelori beside him. Defective goods always sold cheap. They loaded Samuel and 30 other new slaves onto a transport ship. The journey to the dark side took 4 hours. Samuel spent it studying the neural collar around his neck. Every slave wore one. The collars suppressed aggression and willpower. They made resistance feel impossible, like trying to run underwater. But Samuel noticed something strange. The collar hurt him. It sent fire through his nerves when he thought about fighting. Yet it did not make him stop thinking. The Pelori beside him, an elderly male named Oren, seemed almost peaceful under the collar's influence. His eyes were dull. His movements were slow. The collar had hollowed out something essential inside him. Samuel felt the fire, but his mind remained clear. You are new to the collars, Oren said quietly. His voice carried the weight of decades. The pain will teach you to stop resisting. Everyone learns. I learned 42 years ago. 42 years, Samuel repeated. I was young when they took me. I had a family. Children. I do not remember their faces anymore. Oren's voice held no sadness. The collar would not allow sadness. You will forget too. It is easier when you forget. The transport landed. Guards herded them out into absolute darkness. The dark side of the moon never saw sunlight. The only illumination came from harsh work lights mounted on the mine entrance. Samuel looked up at the stars. Somewhere out there was Earth. Somewhere out there were humans who had never worn chains. He wondered if anyone was looking for him. Probably not. The fringe was lawless territory. Ships disappeared there all the time that a guard shoved him forward with an electric prod. Pain exploded across his back. Move, deathworlder. Samuel moved. He walked into the mine with the other slaves, descending into tunnels that reeked of dust and death. Around him, creatures from a dozen different worlds shuffled forward with empty eyes, but Samuel's eyes were not empty. Behind them, something burned. It was not hope. Hope was too gentle a word. It was something older and darker. It was the same thing that had driven humans to cross oceans in wooden ships, to survive ice ages with stone tools, to climb out of the mud and reach for the stars. The Vorth had ruled for 300 years. They had never met a human before. Deep underground, time becomes meaningless. There is no sunrise, no sunset, only the endless rhythm of work and exhaustion. Samuel counted days by the meals they received. 2 small portions of gray, paste, every cycle. Barely enough to survive. Never enough to feel strong. 3 months passed this way. The mines stretched for miles beneath the surface. Thousands of slaves worked the tunnels, extracting crystalline or that glowed faint blue in the darkness. This or powered Vorth warships. Every crystal pulled from the rock meant another weapon, another conquest, another world brought under the hegemony's control. Samuel swung his pick into the wall. His muscles had grown used to the labor. His hands had developed thick calluses. The collar around his neck still burned whenever anger rose inside him, but he had learned to keep that anger low and quiet, like embers hidden beneath ash. That he was not the only human in the mines, but he was the only one still alive. The others had died in cave-ins or from the toxic gas that sometimes seeped through cracks in the rock. Humans were rare in Vorth space. Most ships avoided the sector entirely. Samuel had been unlucky. His cargo route had taken him too close to the border. Near him, a young Mavari female struggled with her pick. The Mavari were tall and thin, with skin that could produce soft light. Once, that bioluminescence had been beautiful. They had been healers, using their light to mend cellular damage in other species. Now their glow was faint and sickly. Starvation had dimmed it. This one was called Sarah. She had been born in the mines. She had never seen stars. Samuel watched her arms shake with effort. The overseers were watching too. Workers who could not maintain pace were removed. Removed meant killed. He moved closer and swung his pick beside hers, breaking the rock she struggled with. The pieces fell, and she quickly gathered them into her cart. "Thank you," she whispered. Her voice was barely audible. Samuel said nothing. Speaking attracted attention, but something passed between them in that moment. A recognition. Sarah looked at Samuel with confusion in her pale eyes. Slaves did not help other slaves. Resources were too scarce. Survival meant focusing on yourself. Yet this human had helped her. Over the following weeks, Samuel continued these small kindnesses. He shared portions of his food with Sarah when the overseers were not watching. He helped an injured Dren worker named Bram hide a broken arm that would have meant execution. The Dren were large, covered in thick brown fur, and had once been builders of impossible structures. Bram had been a construction foreman before his capture. Now he was just another body in the tunnels. Samuel listened to the elderly Pelori named Oren speak about the old days. Oren's collar-dulled mind still held fragments of history, pieces of a galaxy that had existed before the Vorth came. Those stories were treasures. They were proof that things had not always been this way. "Why do you do this?" Oren asked one night as they rested in the cramped sleeping quarters. "Why do you help us?" The collar should prevent such feelings. Samuel touched the metal band around his neck. "It hurts me, but it does not control me. That is impossible." The collars suppress willpower in all species. We tested them extensively before. Oren paused. His eyes flickered with something that might have been memory. "Before we surrendered, you helped make the collars. I was a scientist. When the resistance failed, the Vorth offered skilled prisoners a choice. Help them, or watch your family die slowly." Oren's voice cracked. "I helped them. I told myself I had no choice. But there is always a choice. I simply chose wrong." Samuel absorbed this information. He did not judge Oren. 42 years of guilt was punishment enough. "How do humans resist the collars?" Oren asked. "I do not know. Maybe our brains are wired differently. Maybe we are too stubborn to break. Samuel paused. Or maybe your collars were designed for species that had already accepted defeat. Humans have never accepted anything. Oren stared at him. Behind those tired eyes, something stirred. It was small and fragile, but it was there. A question. A possibility. One night, Samuel discovered a narrow maintenance tunnel that the overseers had forgotten. It led to an old storage area, sealed for decades. Inside, among rusted equipment and collapsed shelving, he found something unexpected that a sword it was ceremonial, clearly, with a curved blade covered in corrosion and a handle wrapped in decaying leather. Strange symbols were carved along the metal. Samuel did not recognize the language, but he recognized the purpose. This was a weapon meant to mean something, and he brought it back to Oren in secret. The old Pelori's eyes went wide. His hands trembled as he touched the blade. For the first time in 42 years, tears rolled down his scaled face. This belonged to Talvin, he whispered. The last war chief. They executed him when we surrendered. They were supposed to destroy this sword. His voice broke. Someone hid it instead. Someone believed that someday, someone would find it. Samuel held the rusted blade. It was heavy, not just with metal, but with history. 300 years. That was how long this sword had waited in the darkness. The it was done waiting. Oren spoke through the night. His voice was soft, barely louder than breathing, but his words carried the weight of centuries. Samuel listened. So did Sarah and Bram, who had crawled closer in the darkness to hear. This was forbidden. Slaves were not allowed to gather. Slaves were not allowed to share history. The Vorith had learned long ago that memory was dangerous. A people who remembered freedom might fight to reclaim it. So they had burned libraries, executed historians, and designed the collars to suppress not just aggression, but the desire to remember. But Oren remembered. The collar had taken so much from him, yet fragments remained. And now, with Samuel's discovery of the sword, those fragments were surfacing like bubbles from deep water. 300 years ago, this sector was called the Coalition of Free Worlds, Oren whispered. 17 species lived together. We traded with each other. We learned from each other. The Pelori created art that made other beings weep with beauty. The Mavari healed diseases that had plagued civilizations for millennia. The Drin built stations that orbited gas giants, cities that floated in the clouds of distant worlds. Sarah's skin flickered with faint light. She had never heard these stories. She had been taught that slaves had always been slaves, that the Vorith had always ruled, that no other way existed. Then the Vorith came, Oren continued. They arrived from beyond the outer rim. No one knows where they originated. They did not negotiate. They did not trade. They simply took. World after world fell. Those who surrendered were enslaved. Those who resisted were exterminated. But we did resist, Bram said. His voice was rough, damaged from years of breathing mind dust. My grandmother told me stories. The Dren fought. Everyone fought, Oren said. The war lasted 12 years. 12 years of battle across 1,000 star systems. Billions died. Billions more. The Vorith did not care about casualties. They had numbers. They had technology. They had patience. We had courage. But courage is not enough against an enemy that feels nothing. Samuel held Talvin's sword across his knees. The rust flaked off under his fingers, revealing glimpses of bright metal beneath. The blade was still sound. 3 centuries had not destroyed it. Who was Talvin? Samuel asked. Oren closed his eyes. He was a Pelori warrior. That sounds strange now, does it not? We are small. We are weak. But Talvin was different. He united the remaining free worlds for one final stand. He led armies of every species against the Vorith fleet. For 3 months, he held them at the boundary line. He became a symbol. As long as Talvin lived, people believed victory was possible. What happened? The Vorith developed the neural collars. They captured coalition soldiers and turned them into weapons against their own people. Talvin's army was broken from within. He was betrayed by his own officers, men whose minds had been stolen by Vorith technology. Oren's voice trembled. They brought him to this very moon. They executed him in public, in the auction house where you were sold. Then they declared the war over. Samuel looked at the sword, and this was his personal blade. It was meant to be destroyed as a final insult, but someone hid it instead. A servant, perhaps. A soldier who escaped. Someone who believed that the story was not truly over. Oren opened his eyes. They were wet. I helped build the collars that destroyed him. I helped create the chains that have bound us for 300 years. Every slave in this sector wears my shame around their neck. Samuel did not speak. What could he say? The old Pelori had made terrible choices under terrible circumstances. Judgment was easy. Surviving was hard. Can the collars be destroyed? Samuel asked. Oren hesitated. Each mine has a control station. The collars are linked to it wirelessly. If the station is damaged, the collars in its range would deactivate. Then we destroy it. The three aliens stared at Samuel. Sarah's light pulsed with something that might have been fear. Bram's fur bristled. Even Oren, who had just shared his guilt, looked shocked. You do not understand, Oren said. The control stations are heavily guarded. The Vorith are everywhere. Even if we reached it, even if we destroyed it, the soldiers would kill us before we could escape. Maybe, Samuel said. It is not maybe. It is certain. Rebellion has been tried. Not here, but in other mines. Other worlds. The Vorith crush it every time. They make examples of the leaders. They execute 10 slaves for every guard killed. Hope is a poison. I told you this when we met. Samuel stood. He held the sword up in the dim light. Rust and all, it caught the glow from Sarah's skin and reflected it back. This sword waited 300 years, Samuel said. Someone hid it because they believed that someday someone would pick it up again. They believed the story was not over. Maybe they were fools. Maybe hope is poison. But I am a human from a planet that tried to kill us every single day for millions of years. We did not survive by accepting the impossible. We survived by being too stubborn to die. He looked at each of them in turn. I am going to destroy that control station. I'm going to free this mine. Anyone who wants to help me can. Anyone who does not can stay hidden. But I am done being property. Silence filled the chamber. Then Sarah's light grew brighter than it had been in years. Rebellion is not a single moment. It is 1,000 small choices made in darkness. Samuel understood this. He had studied history on Earth, back when Earth was his home and freedom was something he took for granted. Every revolution began with people deciding that death was better than chains. The problem was the collars. Even with Samuel's resistance to their effects, most slaves were still suppressed. They could not feel anger. They could not feel urgency. They could think about freedom, but they could not burn for it. As Samuel taught them to remember, he gathered small groups in the abandoned storage area where he had found the sword. He told them stories about Earth. He told them about Spartacus, a slave who led armies against Rome. He told them about Harriet Tubman, who escaped bondage and returned again and again to free others. He told them about ordinary people who stood against impossible odds because standing was better than kneeling. The aliens listened. They could not feel the fire that Samuel felt, but they could understand the logic. They could see that the Vorith were not gods. They bled. They died. They made mistakes. The collars control our emotions, Samuel explained, but they do not control our decisions. You can choose to act even when you do not feel the urge to act. That is what separates thinking beings from animals. We can choose against our instincts. Sarah struggled with this concept. She had been born in chains. The collar had shaped her mind since childhood. But she practiced choosing small rebellions. Hiding food, moving slower than necessary, looking overseers in the eyes for half a second longer than allowed. Each small act cracked the prison inside her head. Bram was different. The Dren were builders, engineers. Once his mind focused on the problem, he attacked it with methodical precision. He mapped the mine's layout from memory. He identified weak points in the guard rotations. He calculated distances and timing with a clarity that surprised everyone, including himself. The collar suppresses emotion, Bram said one night, but does not suppress thought. I always assumed they were the same thing. They are not. Oren provided the critical information. He knew how the control stations worked because he had helped design them. The main processor was vulnerable to physical damage. A strong enough impact in the right place would overload the system and shut down every collar in the mine. The plan took shape over weeks. They recruited carefully, choosing slaves who showed flickers of independent thought. Word spread in whispers, in glances, in the silent language of the oppressed. Something was coming. Not everyone believed it. Not everyone wanted to believe it. Hope had betrayed them too many times. Then Commandant Silas arrived. The rumors had reached him. Productivity was down. Workers were meeting in unauthorized groups. Something was wrong in the deep mines, and Silas intended to find out what he came with 50 guards. They searched the tunnels, dragged slaves from their quarters, conducted interrogations that left bodies behind. 2 Dren workers were executed publicly as a warning. Samuel watched from the crowd. His face showed nothing. Silas found him afterward. The commandant walked slowly around Samuel, those 4 black eyes studying him like a specimen. The human, Silas clicked. I sold you myself. I told your buyer you were unbreakable. It seems I was correct. Samuel remained silent. There are stories spreading through my minds. Stories about a deathworlder who does not obey the collar. Stories about meetings in the dark. Stories about hope. Silas leaned closer. Hope is the most dangerous disease in my facilities. I always cure it quickly. He pressed a device on his wrist. Samuel's collar activated at maximum suppression. Pain flooded every nerve in Samuel's body. It felt like fire and ice and breaking bones all at once. His vision went white. His muscles locked. Other slaves had collapsed instantly under this level of suppression. Their minds simply shut down, unable to process the agony. Samuel stayed standing. His body screamed. Blood dripped from his nose. His hands shook so violently that his bones seemed to rattle. But he remained upright. He looked directly into Silas's 4 black eyes. The commandant stepped back. For the first time in 300 years of overseeing slaves, he felt something unexpected, uncertainty. Put him in the pit, Silas ordered. Solitary confinement. No food, no water, no light. We will see how long his stubbornness lasts. Guards dragged Samuel away. Sarah watched from the crowd, her light flickering with terror. Orrin lowered his head. Bram's hands clenched in a fist despite the collar's suppression. They threw Samuel into a hole in the rock and sealed it above him. 19 days passed. When they finally pulled him out, expecting a broken creature, they found something else entirely. Samuel's body was thin and weak. His lips were cracked. His eyes were sunken. But those eyes held no defeat. They held something worse. They held patience. They held purpose. They held the memory of every slave who had died in these mines. And they held absolutely no fear. Silas saw this. For the second time, he felt that strange new emotion that he should have killed Samuel then. Instead, he made the mistake that would cost him everything that he sent Samuel back to work. The monthly or shipment was the largest operation in the mine cycle. Cargo transports arrived from orbit. Guards supervised the loading. Overseers counted crystals and documented quantities. For 12 hours, half the security force was occupied with logistics. Samuel had learned this pattern during his months of observation. He had refined the plan during his 19 days in the pit. Alone in the darkness, with nothing but his thoughts, he had walked through every step 1,000 times. He knew exactly what needed to happen and when. The night before the shipment, Samuel gathered his people one final time. There were 37 of them now. Pelori, Mavari, Dren, and 3 other species whose names Samuel could not pronounce. They were thin and scarred and afraid. The collars still suppressed their emotions. But they had chosen to act anyway. When the collars fall, you will feel everything at once, Samuel warned them. 300 years of suppressed emotion. Anger, grief, rage. It will hit you like a wave. Some of you will freeze. Some will panic. That is normal. But remember what we discussed. Remember the plan. Find weapons. Secure the exits. And when the Vorith try to restore order, show them what free people can do. Sarah's light was bright now, brighter than it had been since her birth. Her body was producing bioluminescence, as if preparing for something. What about you? She asked. Samuel touched the sword at his hip. He had cleaned and sharpened it during the past weeks. The rust was gone. The metal gleamed. The ancient symbols stood clear against the blade. "I have a debt to pay," Samuel said. 3 centuries old. The shipment began at dawn, or what passed for dawn on a moon without sunlight. Sirens woke the slaves. Guards herded them toward the transport base. The chaos of loading provided perfect cover. Oren and Bram created the first distraction. A minor accident with a cargo loader. Nothing unusual, nothing that would raise alarms. But it drew 3 guards away from their posts. Just as Samuel needed, he slipped through the maintenance tunnels he had mapped over months of careful exploration. The control station was buried deep in the mine's administrative section. 2 guards protected the entrance. Samuel had no weapons except the sword. A sword against energy rifles was suicide. He did not fight fair. He triggered a toxic gas alarm in an adjacent tunnel. The guards rushed to investigate. Samuel moved past them, silent as shadow. The control station was a room filled with machinery. Screens displayed the status of thousands of collars. Each slave was a number, a point on a map, a unit of labor tracked and monitored. Samuel looked at the central processor. It hummed with power. Oren had told him exactly where to strike. One precise blow would overload the system. The collars would lose connection. They would deactivate automatically as a failsafe to prevent neural damage in case of malfunction. Samuel raised the sword. Talvin's sword. The blade that had waited 300 years for this moment. He swung. Metal met machine. Sparks erupted. The processor cracked. The hum became a scream, and then silence. Across the entire mine, thousands of collars went dead at the same instant. For one heartbeat, nothing happened. Then Sarah's light exploded. It was not the gentle glow of a starving Mavari. It was the burning radiance of a healer whose power had been caged for 20 years. She screamed, and her scream contained every emotion the collar had suppressed since her childhood. Joy, rage, grief, hope, love, all of it flooding back at once. Bram rose to his full height. The Dren were large creatures, but the minds had kept them hunched and broken. Now Bram stood 7 feet tall, his muscles remembering strength they had been denied. Throughout the mine, the same scene repeated. Slaves stumbled, wept, roared, and remembered. 300 years of chains falling away in a single moment. The Vorith guards realized something was wrong almost immediately. They began shouting orders. They raised their weapons, but Samuel was already moving to emerge from the control station with Talvin's sword in his hand. Commandant Silas stood in the main corridor, screaming into a communicator that no longer worked. The central processor controlled all communications in the mine. With it destroyed, Silas was isolated. Samuel walked toward him. Not running, walking. "You should have killed me," Samuel said. Silas drew a blade of his own. The Vorith were warriors before they were slavers. 300 years of dominance had not made them weak, but they had never faced a human. Samuel attacked. Earth gravity was stronger than Dravith, 7. His muscles, shaped by a planet that tried to crush everything on it, moved faster and struck harder than any Vorith expected. Silas blocked the first swing. He could not block the second. The ancient blade cut through 3 centuries of oppression with one strike. Silas fell. His head rolled across the metal floor. Around Samuel, the mine erupted into chaos. Slaves overwhelmed guards with numbers and fury. Weapons changed hands. The Vorith retreated, then broke, then died. When it was finished, Samuel stood in the cargo bay, surrounded by the free people of 17 different species. They looked at him with expressions he did not fully understand. Sarah's light touched his face. It was warm. "What now?" she asked. Samuel looked at the stars visible through the open cargo doors. Somewhere out there, the Vorith hegemony still ruled billions. This was one mine on one moon. Victory here meant nothing to the slaves dying in 1,000 other facilities, but it was a start. "Now we keep going," Samuel said, "until every chain is broken." News travels strangely in slave territory. It moves through whispers, through smuggled messages, through the silent communication of the oppressed. Within days of the uprising, every slave on Dravith 7 knew what had happened in the deep mines. Within weeks, slaves across the sector had heard the story that a human had refused to break. A human had found an ancient sword. A human had killed Commandant Silas with one strike. The Vorith tried to suppress the story. They executed anyone caught spreading it. They increased patrols, tightened security, and deployed additional forces to the moon. But stories cannot be killed with weapons. The harder the Vorith fought against it, the faster it spread. 7 other mining facilities fell in the first month. Not because Samuel led those uprisings, but because slaves there had heard what he had done. If one mine could break free, why not another? If one group of prisoners could overwhelm their guards, why not every group? The Vorith hegemony had ruled through certainty. They had convinced the galaxy that resistance was impossible, that defeat was inevitable, that the collars meant eternal submission. Samuel had proven them wrong. That proof was more dangerous than any weapon. Samuel stood in the ruins of the auction house where he had been sold 9 months ago. The cages were empty now. The platforms where buyers had examined slaves were burned. Graffiti covered the walls in a dozen languages, all saying the same thing. Do we remember? Oren walked beside him. The old Pelori looked different now. His scales had regained some of their color. His movements had energy. The guilt remained in his eyes, but it was joined by something else. Purpose. I spent 42 years building chains, Oren said. Perhaps I will spend whatever years I have left breaking them. How many control stations do you remember designing? Samuel asked. All of them. Every facility in the sector. The specifications are still in my head. Oren paused. The Vorith never updated the designs. They believed they had crushed any possibility of rebellion. They became lazy. Then we will use their laziness against them. A commotion at the entrance drew their attention. Sarah arrived with a group of newly freed slaves. Among them were species Samuel had never seen before. Some had 6 limbs. Some had no visible eyes. All of them wore the dead collars around their necks. They gathered around Samuel. They did not kneel or bow. That was important. Samuel had forbidden such things. They were free people now. Free people did not kneel. Scouts report a Vorith battle group approaching, Sarah said. Her light was steady now, controlled. She had learned to focus her power during the past weeks. 12 warships, 20,000 soldiers. They intend to retake the moon. The room went quiet. 12 warships was overwhelming force. The freed slaves had captured weapons and vehicles from the mines, but nothing that could stand against orbital bombardment. Then we leave, Samuel said. We take every transport we can find. We scatter across the sector. We find other mines, other slaves, other people who are ready to fight. They will hunt us, a Dren elder said. Yes, they will hunt us until they catch us or until we catch them. Samuel lifted Talvin's sword. The blade caught the light. New inscriptions had been added beside the ancient ones. The names of everyone who had died in the uprising. 37 names. 37 debts that could never be repaid. The Vorith have ruled for 300 years, Samuel continued. They control vast territories. They have fleets and armies and weapons we cannot match. I will not lie to you. Many of us will die. Perhaps all of us. The road ahead is long and dark and uncertain. He looked at their faces. Pelori, Mavari, Dren, creatures from worlds he had never heard of, speaking languages he could not understand. All of them watching him. All of them waiting. But 300 years ago, a Pelori named Talvin believed the story was not over. He was right. Someone hid his sword. Someone kept hope alive in the darkness. And that hope found its way to me, and I passed it to you, and now you will pass it to others. Samuel sheathed the sword. The Vorith think they have already won. They think we are broken. They think we have forgotten how to fight. He smiled. It was not a kind expression. Let's remind them. The evacuation began that night. Hundreds of ships launched from the moon's surface, scattering in every direction. The Vorith battle group arrived too late to stop them. They found empty facilities and burning symbols painted on every wall that we remember. Across the sector, slaves heard the story. A human from a death world. A rusted sword. One strike that ended 3 centuries of certainty. Some did not believe it. Some were too afraid to act. But others listened and remembered and began to choose. The chains were old. The chains were strong. The chains had held for 300 years, but chains can break. They always break, eventually. All it takes is someone stubborn enough to keep pulling in the cargo hold of a stolen transport. Samuel Ward sat among freed slaves from a dozen worlds. Sarah's light provided soft illumination. Oren drew diagrams of control stations. Bram organized supplies with quiet efficiency. None of them knew what would happen next. None of them knew if they would survive, but they were free. For the first time in their lives, or for the first time in 3 centuries, they were free, and freedom, once tasted, cannot be forgotten. The Vorath hegemony learned this truth in the years that followed. They learned it in burning stations and fallen fleets, and worlds that slipped from their control. They learned it in the eyes of slaves who refused to look away. They learned it from a rusted sword that had waited in the dark for 300 years, and from a human who had been stubborn enough to pick it up.